Hello and welcome to the South Asian Studies Colloquium at Yale. My name is Rohit today. I'm the chair for this academic year and an associate professor in history. It gives us great pleasure to welcome Professor Radha Kumar to the colloquium. And as she reminded us, this is actually her second visit to Yale, and she came here first when she was doing her PhD with one of the early pieces of this project. And it's great to be able to discuss the final work today. Professor Kumar is a historian of colonial and post-colonial South Asia, focusing on the Tamil-speaking regions of southern India. Her first book, Police Matters, The Everyday State and Caste Politics in South India, 1900 to 1975, was published by Cornell University Press a few months ago. It draws on previously unexplored police records to examine the close ties between police and caste authority that were displaced at everyday as well as exceptional moments through much of the 20th century. She's currently working on a second project on the Kaveri River dispute in southern India, which explores how colonial subjects and post-colonial citizens made their claims to water and political belonging between the late 19th and early 21st centuries. Amongst her teaching includes courses in global history, history of India from the ancient period to the present day, and focus on caste and religious politics in modern India. And she's recently also been in part of several conversations looking at policing as a practice more globally. We are also we're running this colloquium as a book panel, and we're very grateful to my colleague, Professor Sivaramakrishnanand, and to Chetana Sabnis for joining us as commentators. Professor Sivaramakrishnanand is a Dinkar Singh Professor of India and South Asian Studies and Professor of Anthropology at Yale. And his work looks at environmental history and the political anthropology of forests, agriculture, human-animal relations, and urban environments in India. He's been working on a project on environmental law and jurisprudence in India over the last few years, and his publications covered these topics and also questions of migration, economic development, nationalism, state formation, cultural geography, and forestry sciences. He has been previously chair of our council and is directs the Inter-Asia program at Yale and is a key figure in our agrarian studies program as well. Chetana Sabnis is a doctoral student in the Department of Political Science at Yale. She's interested in law, crime, political violence, and policing, and her current doctoral research focuses on policing in former British colonies, but with a focus on South Asia. So welcome, and I wanted to begin with inviting Professor Kumar to tell us a little bit about what drew her to the project and give us a sort of brief overview of the themes that it addresses.
Thank you so much, Rohit, and everyone at Yale South Asia Center for inviting me. Thank you, Professor Sivaramakrishnanand and Chetana, for taking the time to read my book and offer comments. I'm really looking forward to hearing them. So I'll start with just a very quick overview of how I came to the project, as Rohit was saying, and what its key interventions are. So I think primarily what this book is trying to do is speak about the everyday presence of the colonial and post-colonial police in rural spaces. And in doing that, it's a bit of a departure from the global policing literature, which tends to focus on cities with very good reason, because, you know, policing being a sort of ephemeral practice, it's really hard to get documents talking about policing in rural spaces. And it was purely by archival accident that I was able to find some of these sources, and which helped me reframe my project to think about how the colonial police did in fact exercise a routine presence in the countryside. And I look at a very small region in southern India. And part of the reason why I do that is this region is really notorious for caste violence. And I grew up myself in Madras, which is a northern city. And as other anthropologists have noted, there is this discursive framing of, you know, the northern city as somehow modern and advanced compared to these southern districts in Tamil Nadu, which, you know, have stayed in the past and they are therefore violent. And so I think, to be perfectly honest, I entered this project with that exact same mindset to study caste violence. And it was only as I started looking at my material that I realized I'm pretty much mimicking the governmental archive of thinking of caste as violence. And that what I need to think of is how caste violence interacts with state violence, or how state violence produces or co-constitutes caste violence. And part of the reason I end up with caste is that when you look at rural policing in vast spaces, unlike the post-colonial police, the colonial police was a fairly small force. And so their need to rely on some kind of colonial knowledge on classifying the population was very high. And so what they are doing is in their everyday practice, going on the beat, writing records, deciding which criminal investigation to follow up on and which to ignore, whom to interrogate in a case of any kind of criminal investigation, whom not to investigate, who can gather at a public space and who can't. In all of these, for a force that is severely limited, having some form of state knowledge and seeing like a state is quite central. And so caste becomes really animating in how policing functions. And as David Arnold wrote earlier, the police organization itself is recruited based on their caste identity. So here what you have is an everyday dynamic between legal subjects and policemen, which is really like looking at society and politics in terms of caste, and therefore reanimating that as a form of identity and as a form of politics in public spaces. So by looking at everyday policing in rural spaces, what I was trying to emphasize is that the police bring legal and epistemic violence into the countryside. So there is politics of violence that come from how policemen can deploy discretionary violence. And there's epistemic violence through objectifying certain castes as, upstarts, as criminal, as fractious, and so forth. But as I, continued working on it, the other thing that I am now pursuing with the book and these other articles is that the minute you're talking about the police as agents of legal and epistemic violence, the ties between the police and as an institution and broader discourses that permeate society are actually really strong. And so what I'm also trying to speak against is the idea of police violence as stemming from rotten apples within the institution, but also as police violence, because police is a violent institution as opposed to the rest of society, which is not violent. And I don't want to enter a conversation about defund the police in the US, but basically my point is, I think it's impossible to understand the police without talking about what kind of discourses and inequalities structure the society in which they function. So bringing those two together has been key to how I've thought about this project. Another point that I wanted to make, which is where I'm really simply drawing upon the global policing literature, is that many theorists have spoken about the police as a sort of bridge state agent that are agents of Foucauldian forms of power as well as Benjaminian forms of power. So policing literature draws on this kind of work that is re-emphasizing the centrality of sovereign violence in liberal states, but it's also drawing on Foucauldian studies that talk about the police as central to the functioning of a certain kind of political economy. And so, I mean, this is not anything that I am contributing to, but this is the literature that I'm drawing on in writing about it. But what that means is that the contrast between colonial states and democratic states can be overdrawn. And I think what I was trying to emphasize throughout is the extent of continuity between the two. And somehow, and tragically, it seems less controversial today, given the extent of police violence we've been seeing globally over the last 2 years. It doesn't seem that shocking to anyone anymore that police violence is key to reproducing inequalities in liberal democratic societies also. But one aspect of the project was that its time frame was from the early 1900s to the Indian emergency. And what I'm trying to say is that there is a fairly high degree of continuity in how police perform these everyday tasks across this period. I mean, I'm happy to stop there, I think, and get some comments and then elaborate more, or I could go into a little more detail. I don't know, maybe Rohit can decide.
If I could invite Professor Sivaramakrishnanand to perhaps offer his comments.
Okay, thank you, Radha, first of all, for such a clear exposition of what you were setting out to do in the book. So I want to begin my little presentation by thanking the South Asian Studies Council and Rohit Dey for inviting me to offer these comments on this fine book by Radha Kumar on the state and caste politics in South India in the 20th century. The book takes up these questions via a study of policing, paying particular attention to the everyday aspects of policing and records that are generated in that process in the form of registers of village crimes, history sheets, and profiles of individuals who might be considered to be bad characters or those who come to be viewed as the usual suspects when a crime or a public disturbance is to be investigated. As the book shows, police personnel were and perhaps remain rather thin on the ground, especially in the countryside. And this led the police to rely on social elites for information on events and reputations of local people. Inevitably, this meant that they came to rely on caste-based assessments of rural subjects to direct their attention to those who were seen as most in need of surveillance or control, drawing on a legacy of using caste to both classify criminal tendency and undesirable vocations, as well as using caste to identify groups most suited for military or police service. The police force had been composed of specific castes and viewed the targets of their policing through an eye jaundiced by caste prejudice. So one of the interesting aspects of this period that is covered in this book, that is the early decades, starting in the early decades, 1902, I think was what she mentioned, is that during those early decades of the 20th century, high caste individuals, especially Brahmins, if you're looking at Madras Presidency and particularly Tamil Nadu, who were a very small numerical minority of the population, were among the earliest to secure modern education and seek white-collar jobs in the government. Thus, the first generation of police officials in the early years of the 20th century were often also Brahmins, as we see, especially when Radha writes about specific officials and gives us their names, it's quite revealing. This happens at precisely the time when the Brahmins are exiting rural life in quite large numbers as well. So for instance, this is also the period when Brahmin Mirasidars are being replaced by other upper caste and middle caste farming communities, as many Brahmins become urban dwelling professionals with attenuated ties to their villages. I wonder if this transition in the social composition of agrarian society of Tamil Nadu comes to play a role in these colonial era decades of policing. It would appear their social power resting less in land control and village level authority begins to shift into a closer alignment with the colonial state, where they begin to serve as subordinate officials mainly. On the other hand, non-Brahmin upper caste peasants who are turning into the new landed gentry of southern Tamil Nadu find themselves more directly in conflict with lower caste and Dalit small farmers and agricultural workers. So it would be good to learn more about these dynamics as they are taking shape in the colonial period and get exacerbated in the post-colonial period when conflict in the countryside becomes at times more violent and persistent in certain parts of Tamil Nadu in the 1970s and 1980s. How, for instance, is the caste composition of the constabulary changing in the period when rural caste violence is taking place more and more among middle and backward castes on the one hand, and Dalits on the other, at a time when these middle castes have come to dominate the ruling political parties like the DMK and the All India Anna DMK. So Radha Kumar rightly notes policing involves the use of discretionary powers that flow from both law and administrative authority, and the police are often at the front line of decisions on the ground that determine when a law is being broken or about to be broken, or when public order is threatened, giving them license to take preemptive measures like imposing prohibitions, making preventive arrests, or disallowing activity that is actually within legally accepted conduct. This is where these discretionary powers come down unevenly on certain social groups defined by caste and class, who are given far less room to maneuver and are viewed with inherent suspicion and persistent disregard for their basic rights. It is possible also that caste mobilized in democratic politics as interest-based solidarity or ethnic identity could facilitate resistance and criticism of atrocities and injustices and provide people who are objectified and treated violently by the police ways to respond in the idiom of caste, in social protest and election participation to repudiate such treatment. In the first part of the book, there is a welcome focus on the FIR, the first information report, where arguably multiple forms of discretionary power that are available to the police station converge. Another area of discretionary power for the police officer in the field was in the maintenance of law and order, where policing on the ground was granted quite a bit of latitude. How the police station identified people to observe, we are told, was determined by ideas about chronic offenders, history sheeters, and lower castes associated with mobile vocations or classed as potentially violent or disorderly. Relying on such stereotypes and the record they generate is a mode of policing that seems to travel across the end of the colonial rules into post-colonial policing, but facing perhaps more challenges from popular politics and electoral constituency building, especially by left parties and new regional parties, or specifically parties that might be seeking to represent lower castes or Dalits, as in the case of Tamil Nadu, the Pudhiya Tamizhagam, for instance. A question that arises here is the extent to which the local constabulary was reliant on local social power holders like landlords, district gentry, and caste elders for the performance of their tasks. How did these rural magnates and people of consequence seek to manage the police by either entering its service or cultivating the police for their loyalty, perhaps even by intimidation, if not offering prebends or invoking persistent hegemony relations? The contrast in post-colonial policing is usefully developed by looking at both better treatment of policemen in terms of conditions of service and training, and the reclassification of habitual offenders. The rowdy sheeters was the new category, Radha tells us, that identified disorderly behavior in contrast to offenses against property, more likely considered by the term history sheet. That said, this chapter left me wondering how social development grows as a state priority and how this newer priority inserts the police in new ways in the lives of villagers and people in district towns. After all, with the expansion of the development state, other line bureaucracies also multiply in rural governance, and the district administration sits at the apex of both the regulatory and revenue system, as well as the development bureaucracy. A related question that comes up is how police power is exercised in relation to civilian authority, usually that of the local magistracy, but also revenue bureaucracy and increasingly a development bureaucracy as well. Moreover, custodial roles sometimes intersected. For instance, in the case of districts where there might be forest department officers and forest guards, as well as military personnel or border security forces, where there might be border posts or cantonments, I understand that may not be so prominent in the southernmost districts of Tamil Nadu. Though these issues are not considered here, they are relevant to the consideration of policing in rural areas in different regions of India. Another aspect of state organized security is intelligence. We don't hear too much about that here. The State Intelligence Bureau, for instance, almost always, these officials are almost always in plainclothes, were also a presence in many districts, sometimes working at cross purposes with the uniformed district police. Because very often the rowdy sheeters and so forth were perhaps valuable to them as sources of information. In the second part of the book, attention has been turned to the impact of party and electoral politics on the structures of authority and domination that were available to the police in the colonial era. The emergence of democratic politics opened up the police system to some public and performative criticism in street protest, administrative complaint mechanisms, and oversight through agencies like the Police Commission and even other commissions like the Minorities Commission or the Scheduled Caste, Scheduled Tribe Commission, and later the Human Rights Commission as well. Politics in different forms provided some recourse for numerous lower caste groups who might also be experiencing some social mobility in the first decades after independence. But it seems such access remained beyond the reach of Dalits for the most part, at least that's what I gathered here. As we learn in the third chapter, routine police violence accompanied interaction with people considered to be loitering or otherwise at a loose end, and the willingness of supervisory and adjudicatory bodies to overlook gratuitous violence in the name of law enforcement was key to the functioning of the police. Forms of impunity were central to the way the police understood their capacity and license. This chapter offers a discussion of the Criminal Procedure Code, section 107, and preventive detention. It seems a show of force by massing uniformed police at events, creating a visible police presence as is often described, and verbal warnings played a role as well in crowd control, but to what extent? And that would be something we might also discuss. Was it not backed by local power when the police was often distant and harder to reach quickly? Preventive arrests and detention required confirmation by an executive magistrate and were often initiated when enabled by that magistrate imposing restrictions on assembly to avert or avoid disturbances. This relationship between the police and the civil administration in matters of preventive restriction and detention can be elaborated further, especially the extent to which this was altered over the early decades after independence. The police station was also a space of arbitration at times, was it not? In what situations did the police assume the role of mediators or conflict mitigators? The point that custodial violence was a manifestation of state power and rarely due to poor training or bad motives on the part of individual police who tortured or otherwise abused people in their custody is also worthy of further discussion. Yes, often such violence on detainees in police custody becomes the kind of routine violence that is intended to reinforce the power and authority of the lower levels of the police, where respect may have been hard to come by. But such exemplary brutality in the police station needs to be authorized by local social elites and overlooked by superior officers to reliably be available as a mode of policing. Again, in post-colonial India, such actions were open to exposure and challenge in party politics and in the realm of police reform. The wider conditions in which custodial violence remained a manifestation of power and not a distortion of authorized and controlled violence can also benefit from further discussion. Violence in many forms is inextricable from policing, but the line between what might be overlooked or covered up and what might lead to a scandal and inquiries was sometimes very hard to estimate, which is why often the police got into trouble that they didn't expect to get into. As the book turns to unlawful assemblies and other public gatherings as objects of policing, we get a fascinating discussion of the use of Criminal Procedure Code section 144 to prevent or restrict assembly. I appreciate the point that Radha Kumar makes that argues riots are not singular events. I think this is a really important point that comes out. Radha Kumar asserts insightfully, they actually form part of a series of activities that manifest as a riot in a certain conjunction of processes. In this regard, while I see that you cite rather the work of Paul Brass on the theft of an idol, you don't discuss his work on riot systems. I wonder how you might contrast the sort of process approach which you take, and I appreciate, with the more sort of structural analysis that Brass is providing. I find the identification of distinct moments of policing intriguing, as it's possible to think about the negotiations and regulation of large gatherings with civilian authorities as part of the policing, in that the maintenance of order, public order, and the prevention of damage to public property or the causing of nuisance and hazard to the public at large requires a kind of interconnected set of activities by civil and police agencies. What is potentially interesting then about the use of executive power through CRPC 107 and CRPC 144 is that the judiciary, once there was a separation of powers and the district magistrate was no longer the district judge, rarely interfered in what was seen as the domain of executive action, the maintenance of public order. It is useful to differentiate public assemblies that were about contesting social rank from those that were directly antagonistic and challenging to state authority. I mean, is that a useful distinction is a question I have. In either case, preventive policing was aimed to keep order and peace, but generated, you might think, different frictions and different solidarities among the people engaged in assembly. Situations where crowd control is involved and firing or lathi charge occurs, there is also considerable room for a situational and contingent unfolding of events due to poor coordination of chain of command, lack of clarity in managing the situation, and acts of impetuosity or even panic on the part of officers and police in the front line of dealing with the crowd. This is where both equipment and training require more examination, as the show of exemplary force can either disperse the crowd or aggravate the situation, depending on how the police seems to be perceived in the moment of that engagement and how organized, persistent, and inflamed the assembly is based on the issue that has provoked it in the first place. The conjoint consideration of caste politics in Tamil Nadu, and just concluding here, and structures of policing in the state remain an enduring contribution of this book. Equally, the focus on everyday and rural policing and the utilization of some rarely deployed archives for this purpose proves to be an effective approach that provides a valuable consideration of the array of colonial era discretionary powers embedded in the CRPC that continue to be routinely used in the repertoire of post-colonial policing. The forging of a citizenry, electorates, and development subjects in the countryside brings new forms of popular mobilization and protest to bear on policing. All this is well documented in the study and makes it vital reading for those interested in state-society relations in South Asia in the 20th century. So thank you, Radha, for writing the book. Among other things, it took me back to a past career when I dealt with these issues more directly in the field. Thank you.
Thank you. Professor Ramakrishnan had an early career as an administrator in India, in the state of West Bengal. Chetana, we'll invite you to offer your comments.
Yeah, I feel like my comments will pale in comparison to Professor Sivaramakrishnan's, but I'll take a go at it. Firstly, Radha, I loved this book. It was so rich and so insightful about this like long time period between 1902 to 1975. And I thought it was very beautifully illustrated how caste politics were invoked and made through the state's policing. And there are many things that stood out to me, but I'll pick out 3 points that especially stood out to me. One was the fact that it becomes obvious that the police was brokering access to the state. And I thought it was very interesting because much of legal history and political science, the discipline I come from in South Asia, focuses on like the role of the courts and then the role of development agencies, but like focusing on the police in some sense gave us like view into other caste groups and how they were able to leverage the police for their gains. And I thought it was very interesting because it expanded our view into how different caste groups, not only the elite upper caste, were able to like exert their power through the police station. And it honestly got me thinking of this, of like the different players in this rural landscape. So like, I'm so curious to get your thoughts on it, which is like, were there missionary agencies at play? And these like powerful caste groups, what was their relationship with violence themselves? Like, did they have their own like militia? And like, how did they decide to make that choice between giving legitimacy to the police or like wielding their own weapons? And that was something that I found I was very curious about. Like, at what point did the police, this foreign agency in some sense, hello?
We can hear you, Chetana.
Oh, sorry, I think,
Yeah.
okay. This foreign agency, in some sense, how did they start accruing legitimacy? That was one thing that I wanted to talk about. The other was also like, the other point that I thought your book beautifully makes is like how caste boundaries were reconstructed and reproduced. You see this like caste group that was considered very low caste, but sort of pushes its way through the caste system, through the police in order to gain dominance. And I was reading this point in light of Paulami Roy Chowdhury's recent book on capable women in capable states. And you see that the police in West Bengal, at least, has become such a weak institution that when NGOs are able to like push their claims with the police, caste stops mattering. She picks up, I think Paulami picks up this one subject of hers who's married to a Dalit, and she finds that the police doesn't seem to regard it as much, especially when the subject enters the room with these NGOs. So I'm curious, at what point do like caste politics stop being relevant to the police in some sense? Maybe like not in an absolute sense, but like how does the weakness of it's interesting that the weakness of the police makes them resort to caste politics, but then when there's another player, they sort of cave. And that was a tension that I was hoping you'd like give your thoughts on. And then the other thing that the book brings out is like what you mentioned, this continuity in police violence. Like it's the same, like in India, even though we have like a demilitarized police, they continue to remain unaccountable. You continue to hear stories of torture and police violence, whether like in these public spaces or even in the station. And what you do bring out that was interesting is the fact that with democratization and like party systems, it becomes a little more complicated because like resistance and like the reckoning with police violence changes. And like you see these lower caste groups able to like voice their anger in the politics of public spaces. And I was reading this in light of what's been happening recently in India, which is like increasingly, it seems like with the central government entering, like for instance, like in the Bhima Koregaon cases, even though the Pune police was like, I think it started off with the Pune police arresting them. And then Uddhav Thackeray was about to say like they can be released on bail. It was the party that was actually like reacting to like public displeasure. But the central government entered, the NIA entered and made it their case. So and then now the cases are back in the judicial system, and it seems like there's very little scope for respite. And I wonder how the tension between like localized state politics and the central government is sort of like affecting who is being targeted with police violence. And in that sense, I was also thinking of like what happened to the police, like probably in the years before independence, when you see these centralized intelligence bureaus being created, and like there's a much more like, I think David Arnold himself talks about like how there were these like IBs created that were more focused on intelligence gathering and like surveillance in a way that wasn't there a little before the nationalist movement. So I'd love to talk about that tension as well. This more or less like summarizes what I had in mind. I don't know if there's anything else I can add, but yeah, I'm happy to hear what you have to say.
Thank you so much, Chetana. So Radha, if you want to take a few minutes to respond to any of these questions, and after that, we'll start collecting questions from the audience as well. Thanks.
Sounds good. Thank you so much, Professor Sivaramakrishnanand. Thank you so much, Chetana. These are fantastic questions, and I'll answer some of them and think about the rest later. So one thing that you were talking about, Professor Sivaramakrishnanand, was about the role of the magistracy and how the police are reacting with that, right? So civil versus political authority. And actually that is really fascinating. And that's one thing I'm still thinking about, which is that certainly the police have deep ties to the magistracy within a region, especially the higher levels of magistracy, I think. And so again, I'm going anecdotally here, where there are some, so there's one torture case that's really fascinating from the 1920s. And the policeman is from one district. The custodial death happens in a different district. The magistrates of the other district find him guilty, with no reason, with no doubt, in a magisterial inquiry. The case is transferred to his district, where he's pronounced innocent. And I think basically what I'm getting at is the extent to which police power enmeshes itself even in local magisterial power. I mean, sure, there are individuals who resist it and there are those tensions, but by and large, how much it is, I think, spatially rooted in a region, but also in a region that is defined by states' writing practices and bureaucratic practices. So the district borders, I think, are central to how police are able to exercise their power. And this connects with how often transfer is a form of punishment for policing, which is something that is, I think, a little strange and needs to be thought about, which is why a police officer accused of violence in one town is punished by simply sending him to a different town. And I think one way to make sense of that is policing has teeth when it is part of local power structures. And I think what I have spent time on in the book is how it becomes part of local caste power structures. And what I've spent less time talking about is how it's also part of local civil power structures. And that, I think, also shows a lot of resilience of policing authority, because in 1856, 57, when the Indian Police Act, just before it's written, the Madras Presidency Police is reconstituted specifically to separate the police from magisterial officers, because until then they have the ability to collect revenue as well as perform criminal procedure. And so there is technically, institutionally, a separation. There is certainly some tension. So, every time there is a case, a custodial violence charge against the police, there's definitely resistance to having it interrogated by the magistracy, and a lot of resistance to having it interrogated by the judicial system, which is seen as completely, which is a different body. But I think in practice, within a locality, police ties with magisterial powers are quite strong. And I think this also connects to how police are definitely recruited locally versus the reserve police who are brought in from outside. So I think this everyday exercise relies on social ties. Violent policing, where you come and get your arms and shoot on a body, relies on not having those intimate connections. So it's an intimate form of power that leaches on to civic bureaucratic authority as well as to social caste authority, I think, is the broad point that I would make there. Regarding the role of Brahmins, it is very interesting. And I think what I sense is that, how Brahmins become a caste is very much rooted in urban spaces, like MSS Pandian is saying, where they are moving out and they are refashioning themselves as modern casteless elite. And I think it is possible that the Brahmins who are so much present in these anecdotes about police power, it might well stand to show how even within the police institution, power is coming not just from being a policeman, but also from being a high caste policeman. And so, there is something going on there. The other related point is, I think the Brahmins who are, suppressing Dalit labor protests during harvest and so forth, are sort of cementing their position within the village. But Brahmins don't coalesce in public spaces to assert their identity as Brahmins. And there they are, in fact, speaking of the public sphere as a casteless sphere, again, as MSS Pandian is saying, because I think they are rarely on the other end of police violence. And it is the middle and lowest caste that are objects of violence that are really shaping their identity as a caste in public spaces. And this definitely becomes more pronounced after the 30s itself, and especially after the 70s. So I would say after the 30s, as there has already been migration of Brahmin elite who've sold their land to move to the cities, the middle castes are asserting their authority through public performance of their casteness. And after the 50s, as Dalits start asserting their rights to spaces, the backlash is quite high. But the reason I want to talk about Brahmins is, I think, precisely to second what Pandian wrote, which is that this Brahmin claim of being casteless in public space is rubbish, right? To use like a very non-technical phrase, because they are very much part of the state apparatus that is ensuring a caste hierarchy through policing practices, even though it is not their caste identity that is visibly being manufactured or refashioned through these politics. So that was the second point. In terms of police impunity and its continuation after 1947, which I think both of you had mentioned, what I'm finding is that the extent to which there is a questioning of police practice in public spaces and in politics is not matched within the court, where there is a very formal adherence to evidentiary protocol, which allows for police impunity. So, you know, there might be a huge public protest about the custodial violence where a Dalit died, and there might be a human rights commission that, you know, protests it. There might be a public inquiry, but at the end of the day, the beyond reasonable doubt adversarial courtroom procedure can never convict anybody. So, you know, that is one problem, which is the gap between how evidentiary protocol itself changes and how public opinion changes, which is why I'm not surprised that a political party which is keen to hold its legitimacy is willing to challenge this. But then once the court is in the case against the police is inside a court system, there's not much that can be done. It's sort of trapped with those formations. And the other implication of this is that I think the targets of police violence do shift. So, I mean, Dalits continue to be targets of violence, but you know, in the 1990s, there are immoral women that start appearing as objects of police violence way more than earlier, when in a sense, you know, maybe they were sexually assaulted, but it is not as much a case of women fighting for political rights who become legitimate objects of policing. That is not happening earlier, but with a far higher level of conversation about the importance of female chastity or morality and so forth, there does seem to be, at least in the archives, an upswing of, you know, lathi charging Dalit women who are out asking for wages, who've had affairs and so forth, in a way that didn't happen earlier. So I do think there is some effect in the sense of who can be a target of police violence is shifting according to broader currents. And here, Tamil Nadu might be a bit of an exception to understanding how much things are changing because of its resistance to the Hindu majoritarianism, at least to the extent in which it's taken over the rest of the country, and the resilience of caste politics. So to that extent, the Elgar Parishad sort of striking story is less present. What you have is continued violence against Dalits. So I think the very vibrancy of caste politics in Tamil Nadu implies that, you know, police enmeshing with caste politics has salience. And to that extent, Chetana, I think, you know, they don't lose teeth because they are still part of these caste politics in a very intimate way. And maybe I'll answer one last question, which is about development. Again, here, Tamil Nadu might be an exception because of how stubbornly it held on to prohibition as a form of development, and the ways in which prohibition became part of a DMK versus ADMK platform well into the 90s. So that meant that development often translated into policing prohibition, policing illegal brewing of liquor and so forth. And it almost overwhelms other aspects of development, except I think election to local councils and panchayats, which also become very, very violent by the 90s, but which I don't cover in my book. So maybe I'll stop there. I don't know.
Thank you so much, Radha. I'm going to invite Professor Ginny Lokanitha to ask her question. Sorry, Ryan, could you either shift hosting to me or let Ginny speak? Yeah, thanks. Ginny, go ahead, please.
Okay, thank you. So thanks so much, Radha. This was wonderful. I was wondering whether, I mean, I know that the book sort of ends, focuses still the emergency. I was wondering whether you can explore a little bit whether the emergence of more consolidated civil liberty and democratic rights movements in the post-emergency period suggests any discontinuities from colonial to post-colonial period in police violence in any way at all.
Absolutely. I mean, yeah, that's an important question. And I definitely need to, well, wait for those records to become available, I guess. And they are very, very hesitant to release anything after the 70s in the Tamil Nadu archives, which is one problem. So definitely records from 77 and 78 are full of policing, full of about how much it is important to restrain policing. Having said that, individual instances of police torture and violence continue. But, you know, the human rights movement definitely increases, definitely places a check on policing. There is a lot more coverage in newspapers about potential human rights violation. When I went to these police stations to collect the material, interestingly, no one is inside the lockup itself. They're all out in the common room because the police are so worried that could be a case of custodial death, and you know, they could be hauled up by a Human Rights Commission for that. So nobody was inside a lockup. They were just hanging out outside. Having said that, I think two things are happening. One, as I said, the targets are changing. So there's this very revealing case from the 90s where a woman who's a middle caste laborer is arrested in an all women's police station. And I feel like the emergence of these all women police stations that really picks up in the 90s is bringing in domestic inequality and patriarchal violence as a fair area of play for policing. Because the minute you have police women handling these issues, ensuring that a woman keeps her marriage going seems to be fair game, right? So it, in fact, ups the pressure on women to not make complaints about domestic violence, not want to walk out on a marriage, not have affairs and so forth, because there seems to be far more ease about arresting women in an all women's police station. Where also, so, you know, in the 90s, this woman is arrested because she's been previously married and divorced, and now she's just living with somebody or has an affair with somebody. That man's wife complains. She is taken to the all women's police station. She's found dead the next morning. And, you know, just the fact that she's arrested for having an affair is, you know, it blows my mind. But I think it is permissible in an all women's police station. The local CPI and human rights commissions really raise hell, and there's an inquiry. But, you know, the policewomen are acquitted because you're going back to old forms of, you know, finding respectable witnesses, using medical records and so forth. So yes, there is pressure, but the pressure possibly allows a shift in tactics rather than eliminate violence, which is not shocking at all. But the other direction, which again, I'm getting a sense of only from things like honor killings, is that there is a bit of winking at caste violence. So the violence is spilling outside the police station into private conflicts, which happen with the, I guess, implicit tacit support of policing. So I think the explosion of caste violence in the form of honor killings and activity against violence against Dalits, but outside the police station, outside formal political gatherings, is part of the shift where, you know, they're avoiding culpability by not actually having it happen in a formal procession or, you know, a formal capacity, but, you know, the false FIR or not registering complaints or filing complaints about, you know, love jihads or whatever, that has gone up. Very long-winded and unclear answer, sorry, but I really should think a little more about this.
I'd like to invite my colleague, Professor Shyam Sundar from the School of Management.
Yes, thank you. I think, though I have not read the book, this was very, very illuminating, very interesting, rich set of observations and from your study on the field about what is happening with police violence, recruitment, etc. But looking at it from a distance, I couldn't help thinking, is it fair to say that similar things would be found with respect to recruitment, police violence, and elsewhere outside Tamil Nadu? Or are there aspects of police behavior that stand out in your mind from your studies that say, this is something which is likely to be unique or special in that setup?
Yeah, absolutely. I would imagine that there are parallels in other parts of the country. It might not follow the logics of caste everywhere. And in Tamil Nadu, for various reasons, caste politics have been, you know, the primary, you know, form of public identity and asserting rank. In other parts of the country, you know, the divide between Dalits and middle caste have, you know, been marked and violent in many parts of the country in the 1980s and 90s. So I think there the likelihood that police power overlapped with these caste lines between middle castes and Dalits is very likely. And certainly today, over the last few years, what we've seen about the persecution of Muslims in different parts of the country would, I think, follow similar patterns in terms of whether you're filing a false case against somebody, whether you're granting a community permission to, you know, carry their dead through a particular street, whether you're, how you are perceiving different groups. I think those techniques of policing are likely to be common in many parts of the country. Which groups are the objects of police attention and violence is probably different, but yeah, I would imagine that, you know, a bit of caste and a bit of religious majoritarianism probably occurs in different parts of the country.
So I'm going to jump into the queue and I was going to invite you to talk a little bit about what the impact of doing the study through these archives of police stations and the ways in which looking at that archive perhaps offers a different history from the kind of existing work on policing, which is drawn out of, you know, the Ministry of Home or provincial capital, home and law order ministries. And you have this wonderful evocative phase of like reconstructing the beat of, or the vision of the police constable. And what does it mean to think of this figure, which has often been seen as a figure of violence, as a kind of real figure